Hello there and welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett along with Kent Myers. We're here every week, as you know, meeting interesting people and dealing with topical issues, and I'm looking forward to today's show.
Well, today we're going to talk about something that you hear a lot about in Oklahoma and elsewhere, but sometimes our viewers don't know much about the topic of grand juries. A grand jury is different than a regular jury, whatever a less than grand jury is. And we're going to find
a mysterious process.
It is.
Yeah.
It's kind of a star chamber proceeding, as they're sometimes referred to. But we're going to find out all about grand juries, why we have them, how they work, how they're composed, what they do, what they don't do, and what people can say when they've appeared before a grand jury and what they can't. We've got two of my partners, Tom Snyder and Andre Caldwell, going to be with us today to talk about that. These guys know an awful lot about it because they've shepherded people through grand juries, both as prosecutors and as defense lawyers.
We'll try to remove some of that mystery today on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
I've been fortunate enough to premiere every film that I've produced at Sundance. Seeing your film on the big screen for the first time in front of an audience at the Sundance Film Festival is unmatched. I'm Chad Burris. I'm an attorney, film producer, film financier, economic development financier, and I'm Chickasaw. Nobody can argue that modern day media, cinema, has perpetuated this myth, this idea of the Indian and what that is. And just the idea that, all Indians look one way or all Indians act one way is a terrible injustice. Being able to have filmmakers tell stories that are representative of some element of his surroundings, his upbringing, what they know, what they see through their own eyes, that other people get a chance to bear witness to around the world. I think that's amazing. For me personally, being an Indian today means being responsible, honest, progressive, and giving that back to the community.
Learn more about today's Chickasaws at profilesofanation.com.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guests.
Today we're really pleased to have two of my partners from Crowe and Dunleavy join us to talk about something they spent a lot of time dealing with, and that's the subject of grand juries. On my right is Andre Caldwell. Andre is a University of Oklahoma law graduate, did his undergraduate work at Wofford College. He served as an assistant district attorney in the Western District of Oklahoma with distinction, I might add, when he was assigned to the Violent Crime and Organized Crime Task Force. After he left the U.S. Attorney's Office, he came to Crowe and Dunleavy in 2012 and has been here ever since. He is also vice chair of the board of Positive Tomorrow's organization, an organization that deals with kids and families that are in trouble. Andre is making his first visit. Andre, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
On my left is Tom Snyder. Tom did his undergraduate work at Baylor University, did his law work at Harvard Law School. He likewise was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern California area for a number of years. He was involved in white-collar crime defense work since he joined Crowe Dunleavy. And he's also involved, of course, in grand jury work, which comes with that. He joined Crowe Dunleavy in 2012, the same year as Andre did, and since that time, they've been our dynamic duo on grand jury matters. This likewise is his first visit. Tom, welcome. Glad to have you.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Ken.
All right, a very basic question. What is a grand jury? Who wants to start with that?
I'll jump in and take that one. It's funny because so much mystery surrounds the idea of the grand jury, and What people are most commonly used to is our trial juries, the ones you see on television. Those are actually called petit juries. Petit, the French word for small, typically consists of a group of 6 to 12 people who sit to determine whether someone is guilty or innocent of a crime. The grand jury is actually an investigative body that's used to initiate the charges. It can be composed of several different people, of course different between the state and federal system. And they sit and hear evidence to determine whether to initiate charges by the return of an indictment.
I see. Is the pool of citizens who would be considered for a grand jury the same as would be considered for a petit jury?
Certainly can be, and Tom and I can speak a little bit more to this with respect to the differences between the state and federal system. But for the veneer persons for a grand jury in the federal system, they're often composed of those who have driver's license registration and voter registration. For the state or the multi-county grand jury, which is impaneled by the Attorney General's office, those individuals are chosen from driver's license registration.
I see, but Tom, they're not picked by some sort of educational background or knowledge base. In other words, if it was a grand jury to investigate some sort of business situation, you wouldn't try to find a jury of peers to serve. It would be people with less information than that.
It is largely the same people that would be sitting on a particular petit jury in a regular criminal case. So, for example, in a grand jury in the Western District of Oklahoma, at the federal level, all those folks live in the Western District of Oklahoma. You could easily get a subpoena for a petit jury or the grand jury.
I see.
And it's really grand jury only in the sense that it's bigger than the petit jury.
The petit jury serves for the duration of the trial and comes to a decision about what's the right outcome of that trial, be it civil or criminal. The grand jury is ahead of the trial. The trial hasn't occurred because charges haven't been brought yet, and that's what that jury's role is. You have grand juries, I guess, in how many different settings? State and federal, multi-county? What are the
That's correct.
types of grand juries we have?
So you can have a state, a federal, or a multi-county grand jury, and I'll speak from the federal perspective.
Okay.
That was the background that Tom and I had in our experiences as assistant U.S. attorneys. The federal grand jury is actually comprised of persons from that certain district. Here in Oklahoma City, we live in the Western District. 44 of the 77 counties of Oklahoma, the veneer persons for our grand jury are chosen from those individuals, again based on driver's license registration and voter registration. The state,
And the state side, it's similar, again, driver's license registrations, which the perception is because the federal take their jury veneer from voter registration that you get a higher quality of grand jury, right or wrong, that's the perception. But the state, either counties can impanel their own. There's also the multi-county grand jury, which is overseen by the Attorney General. Generally speaking, those are bigger, more intensive, long-term investigations. The states actually individual counties don't like to do their own grand jury investigations. They typically proceed by preliminary hearing when they make their charging decisions, but there are two different ways of going about it.
So is it a district attorney that puts together a grand jury?
Yeah, the district attorney is going to oversee it. When you're going to impanel a grand jury, and one of the things that's interesting in the state is there's a process by which a citizen can initiate a petition to have a grand jury impaneled. If they think something's wrong, they gather signatures, and they can actually basically force the district attorney to impanel a grand jury to investigate something.
Well, does the district attorney have an option? They could either press charges for an alleged crime themselves, or they could call a grand jury?
Yes, they have a choice. When they're going to charge a case, they can either just charge it by complaint, and then they have to do what's called a preliminary hearing for the probable cause determination. That's really what's going on a case-by-case basis, or they can impanel a grand jury and proceed that way and have the probable cause determination done, and then they proceed by way of what's called an indictment.
And what reason would a DA have for calling a grand jury as opposed to just pressing charges?
Andre, do you want to?
absolutely. Typically, there would be long-term investigations that a DA would impanel a grand jury for.
So he needs more evidence?
Exactly.
Or he or she needs more evidence?
He or she would need more evidence. The grand jury, like I said at the beginning, is an investigative body, so they can issue subpoenas for certain documents. They can issue subpoenas for certain witnesses. The multi-county grand jury actually has an enumerated list of offenses in the statute for which they are impaneled to investigate, some of them being homicide or public corruption, something of that sort. Misdemeanors are not presented to the grand jury often. And then some of your smaller felonies, and I say smaller not to denigrate from the seriousness of them, but simple drug possession, things of that nature, a DA would typically just initiate a complaint to start.
In the normal petit jury situation, the jurors are discharged after the case is over. In the grand jury situation, I guess grand juries can last over a long period of time. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Both the state and federal, they generally last about 18 months and can be extended if they need to.
But they don't meet every day for 18 months, do
No, they generally meet once a week. Well, it depends on where you are.
That's true.
In San Diego, in the Southern District of California, they had panels that met every single week. I think in the Eastern District, for example, I think they meet once a month.
That's correct.
And so it lasts 18 months, but they're not meeting every day or even every week. It just depends on how busy the district is. I mean, in San Diego, we had a very, very heavy criminal docket, and so they had to have grand juries in every single week to hear a lot of those cases.
And how long does typically a grand jury sit?
Usually 18 months, but they can be extended. And usually what happens, the problem is if the grand jury expires when you're mid-investigation, you have to start over with a new grand jury. And so if you have a long-term investigation that you have one particular panel looking at, and you're not done with your investigation yet, you need to extend them so you don't have to start over at square one with a new panel.
So you can extend it if you're not finished, or you can terminate it, start it over with the second grand jury.
Correct.
Do it over again.
That's right.
Get a mulligan.
But you don't usually want to take that mulligan if you can avoid it.
Yeah, Andre, you have both had experience on the prosecution side of a grand jury. How does that different?
You know, the best way to address that is to identify the persons that are present before the grand jury. And so from the federal perspective, in the grand jury room, you typically have the prosecutor, the assistant U.S. attorney, the court reporter, the grand jurors, a deputy foreperson and a foreperson is identified, an interpreter if necessary, and the witnesses. Defense attorneys are not present within the grand jury. There's no judge present within the grand jury. And so what they are hearing is the prosecutor side of the story only. Now, as I mentioned, that's on the federal side. On the state side, the defendant or potential target may be allowed to testify before the grand jury and present their own testimony with the assistance of an attorney. In the federal system, targets are not often called into the grand jury. Someone may be called as a witness and may become a target during the course of the testimony. They are allowed to have an attorney, but the attorney cannot be present within the grand jury room. And so to the extent there's any issue regarding incriminating evidence, they would have to ask to stop their testimony, leave the room, consult with their attorney, and then return.
Andre Caldwell and Tom Snyder are informing us more about the grand juries, the system. We'll have more after this.
Life-sustaining clean water. In places where access to it requires more than the turn of a faucet, an engineer creates a plastic filtration device using natural gas compounds. By removing viruses and bacteria, these innovations bring relief and confidence to entire communities. Oklahoma resources are serving a bigger purpose beyond our state. Let's use them to solve even more challenges.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
We are back on the set of The Verdict learning more about grand juries and how they're formed and why they're formed. Andre Caldwell and Tom Snyder are our guests.
Let's talk a little bit about the differences, if any, in the burden of proof on what must be presented to, for instance, get a conviction in state or federal court for the violation of criminal law on the one hand, and to get an indictment out of a grand jury on the other hand. Tom, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think one of the most important things that people need to understand is the grand jury really just brings charges. It's not indicative of guilt or innocence. I think there's a perception, because it's called a grand jury, that when you hear a grand jury indictment, people assume, well, they must be guilty of doing something. That's really not the case at all. A grand jury really makes a probable cause determination, which means they have to have enough information to have reason to believe that a crime was committed and the person charged did it. It's actually a very low burden of proof. It's lower than preponderance of the evidence, which we use in civil cases, and it's way lower than beyond a reasonable doubt, which is what a petty jury has to find to convict somebody after trial. So you don't need a whole lot of evidence, and we can get into how this it goes about, but there's other procedural issues that make it very easy for a prosecutor to indict just about anybody for just about anything.
Is that the same standard that is employed in a preliminary hearing?
It is. It is. But in a preliminary hearing, there's actually kind of a preview of the trial, if you want to call it that, and a judge will make the probable cause determination rather than a grand jury.
Is there a difference in the burden of proof between a state grand jury and a federal grand jury?
There is not a difference. Probable cause is the standard when looking at the grand jury. The one difference that might exist between the two systems is that more preliminary hearings are held in the state system because the grand jury is often not impaneled to charge, as opposed to the federal system where individuals are charged by indictment. We have two mechanisms for charging in the federal system, a complaint and an indictment. However, a conviction can only be obtained upon plea to an indictment or plea to an information, which is a whole other topic we could go down some other time. But nevertheless, when an indictment is returned by the grand jury, there is no preliminary hearing because the grand jury has already made a determination of probable cause.
Well, Tom, why is there this cloth of secrecy around a grand jury?
Well, it's primarily because it has this function as an investigative body where it does long-term investigations, and they try to do their investigations in secret because theoretically they may come back without returning charges at all. And so the secrecy enables them to do their investigation more effectively, but also protects the people under investigation because there may be names, there may be witnesses that get called in that are considered for charges but never are. And as we talked about, people just assume, they hear grand jury indictment, they assume guilty, and so oftentimes in our cases the biggest battle is trying to keep the client from being indicted in the first place. Because for public relations and other reasons, the indictment itself, we saw this with Ms. McClendon, that the indictment itself can be almost as damaging as an ultimate conviction might be.
Well, talk about secrecy a little more. If X comes before the grand jury and is a target of the grand jury, or becomes a target of the grand jury, is X restricted from talking about it outside to anybody? I mean, can he go home and talk to his wife about it? Can he talk to his lawyer about it? In the federal system, the lawyer's not in the grand jury.
That's right.
So can he talk to his lawyer about it? I mean, just how far does that secrecy go?
So X as the witness is the only one that the secrecy rules do not apply to.
So X can say whatever the
X can talk
wants
about their testimony before the grand jury. X can discuss it with their lawyer. Oftentimes, because of the matters occurring before the grand jury and the reason, or with X's testimony, they don't want to disclose to others that they may be a target or that they may be a witness in an investigation, because then they draw a lot of attention to themselves. All the other members who are participating in the process, the court reporter, the foreperson, the assistant U.S. attorney, they are all sworn to secrecy based on the statute or the federal statute.
Let's change our witness from X to Y. Okay. And Y is a witness that's just coming forth to, for instance, to identify records. These are the records, I maintain the records, here they are. Not the target, hadn't done anything wrong, but has to testify before the grand jury. Is Y held to secrecy in that circumstance?
No, the witnesses are always free if they choose. Now both at state and federal level, they will try to encourage you to remain quiet about it, and they'll try to make it seem as if it'd be better for you not to say anything, and oftentimes it is better not to say anything, but you're not bound by the secrecy rules. Now, interestingly enough, the secrecy rules apply in between the government. So the criminal prosecutor who has a criminal grand jury cannot take the information he gets and share it with, for example, a civil prosecutor or a civil AUSA who may have a civil case that relates to the same topic. There has to be very strict firewall between those two things. They can get a lot of trouble if they don't maintain that.
What type of volume are we talking about in a county the size of Oklahoma County? Is there always going to be at least one grand jury taking place, or is it unusual to have a grand jury be seated?
You know, we don't hear about county grand juries very often. It seems like, again, in the county process, that mechanism's not used frequently. The multi-county will often sit for an extended period of time, and they will hear several cases from several different counties. As Tom mentioned earlier, they can sit for 18 months, and by statute, be extended up to 24 months. In a county grand jury, they're typically just sitting for the purpose of one investigation, and as soon as it's over, it gets wrapped up. By contrast, in the federal system, at least with respect to the Western District, we have two different grand juries. They sit for 18 months, but they meet every other week, once a month, and I should say that. And so we always have the ability to present an indictment if necessary, and they will hear a multitude of cases, just kind of depending on what the U.S. Attorney's Office needs to present within certain time constraints.
So there's, if the workload increased, they're not going to have 5 grand juries seated. They're going to stick with that 2, and that's just sort of the budgetary process and the system that's in place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as mentioned, you know, it's district by district. The northern or the eastern district in Muskogee, my understanding, has 1 grand jury. They may not have as much volume as the western district. Where Tom came from in San Diego, they had a grand jury that essentially sat every day. California is a big state. They have a lot of immigration offenses that occur, a lot of drug offenses that occur, so they may meet very often. I believe he said every day.
Yeah, we had 5 different panels, and most of them met every week for that 18-month period of time. So that's quite a time burden on the grand jurors themselves. Right, well, and they would hear 15, 20 cases a day.
I was just saying, give opinions on this. Is this a good system? What could it be better?
You know, it's such an old system, and it originally was designed to put some citizens between the prosecution and the people who are being investigated. The problem, as I see it, is because of the very low standard of proof, the probable cause standard of proof, a prosecutor can go in and basically get whatever result they want by how they present the evidence. The rules of evidence don't apply the same way. Hearsay is permissible. Like I said, the defense does not have any right to be there or present their side of the case. So the prosecutor wants an indictment, they can get an indictment. Now, hopefully, this is the hope there, is the prosecutor, if he indicts it, he's got to prove it at trial eventually beyond a reasonable doubt. So your hope is that the prosecutor's never going to seek an indictment that he doesn't think he can prove at trial. But there have been enough examples where that hasn't happened that I think that's one of the main criticisms. Too much power in the hands of the prosecutors.
Absolutely, and you've probably heard the phrase from the state court judge in New York that the grand jury would indict a ham sandwich, and that's often one associated with a criticism of the grand jury. The fact that, as Tom states, the prosecutor can really sort of manipulate this process. The grand jury hears one side of the story. Hearsay is admissible, or you don't have to worry about admissibility because there are no rules of evidence that apply. The prosecutor can actually use evidence that was seized illegally in the course of their presentation. And we're not suggesting that often happens, but just an understanding of what kind of power is wielded by a prosecutor by use of the grand jury.
When you get to trial, the prosecutor's got an obligation to, in some way that I'm not quite familiar with, present exculpatory evidence or make exculpatory evidence available. We just have about 30 seconds. That doesn't happen in the grand jury. There's no requirement that exculpatory evidence be presented to the grand jurors, is there?
There is no requirement that exculpatory evidence be presented.
All right. Hey, thank you guys for coming on the show very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Andre Caldwell and Tom Snyder, working on grand jury situations and letting us learn more about them as well. Kent and I'll have a final word when we get back.
There are now 11 million of us who live here and work here. I was 15 when I came here 6 years ago. I raised my family here, drive my truck to my job every day. The only difference between now and 6 years ago, I do it legally. I wanted to. Because this is my home.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be Mom and Dad to me.
I really think people are so unaware of the number of kids waiting just in Oklahoma. And I think if more people knew that those children were out there waiting, I think that just by the way we live our lives and the people we talk to, that maybe we can help encourage adoption from Oklahoma.
You will always be Mom and Dad to me.
The Journal Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers wrapping up a show on grand juries.
Yeah, Tom Snyder and Andre Caldwell really do a wonderful job for us, and there are a lot of other lawyers around the city and state that do the same for their clients. But they've done it on both sides of the aisle, from not only the defense side but the prosecution side. It's an integral part of our judicial system that can have its pluses and minuses like all the others, but they administer it very well.
Their bios are available at their website, crowdunlevy.com. And we have a website, theverdict.tv. Log on, tell us about a guest you'd like to see or a subject you'd like to see us discuss on a future show. That's going to do it for this week's show. So glad you joined us. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We will see you next week right here on another edition of The Verdict.